A plain cardboard box, no return address, no sender name, no stamps, just a sealed package left at the front steps of the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office in Northern California. When the deputies opened it, they didn't find paperwork. They didn't find evidence. They didn't even find a threat. What they found was a human skull and a letter with a crudely hand-drawn map and 7 words scrawled in trembling ink. This is where you'll find the rest. That moment, November 25th, 1987, began one of the most chilling, shadow-soaked investigations in California's history. Not because it started with a crime scene, but because it started after the crime was done, and the person it belonged to. Her name was Kay Josephine Medin, a 48-year-old elementary school teacher, a woman who vanished one summer morning in the Trinity wilderness, without a sound, without a trace, and without warning. She didn't drive off. She didn't leave a note. She didn't even take her glasses. What happened to her in those dense Northern California woods would stay buried, literally, for nearly 4 decades, until fragments of her story started washing ashore, sometimes in boxes, sometimes in shallow graves, and sometimes on beaches where only seagulls and silence remain. This is the horrifying, twisted, and deeply unsettling true story of Kay Josephine Medin, a missing woman whose mystery was solved not by witnesses or confessions, but by bones mailed to a sheriff's office and a coastline that wouldn't keep its secrets buried forever. August 3, 1987. A sweltering summer morning blanketed the remote mountain town of Palm, California, a place where time seemed to slow, tucked deep in the wilderness of Trinity County. Kay Medin, a quiet 48-year-old school teacher, was home alone. Her husband Nicholas had left for a business trip, and Kay, she had just returned from visiting her mother in Redding, barely a 2-hour drive away. By all accounts, nothing was out of the ordinary. No fights, no arguments, no disturbances. She had her usual morning coffee. She spoke to a neighbor. She was seen walking her dog the day before. Her car was in the driveway. Her glasses, purse, and all personal belongings were still inside the house. And then, nothing. Kay Medin simply vanished. Nicholas returned home days later to find the house eerily still. No sign of forced entry. No broken glass. No blood. Nothing missing except her. The bed was untouched. The coffee pot still had old grounds. Her reading glasses, something she never left without, sat exactly where she'd always leave them. He reported her missing immediately, and the community, small and tightly knit, responded fast. Search parties combed the woods. Helicopters scanned the dense pine ridges. Dogs were brought in from neighboring counties. They found absolutely no sign of her. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single indication that she had ever left her home willingly or otherwise. Now, here's where things get dark, fast. 2 months later, November 1987, 45 miles away in Humboldt County, a package arrives at the sheriff's office, unmarked, unclaimed. Inside a partial human skull, the package also contained a hand-drawn map, crude, shaky, but legible. It pointed to a dirt logging road in the Ammon Ridge area, deep in the backwoods where loggers hadn't operated for years. Investigators followed the trail, and what they found was a dismembered skeleton, scattered among rocks and brush, like someone had been trying to hide what was left. The bones were degraded, exposed to the elements, some possibly moved by animals. There were no clothes, no jewelry, and no clear signs of trauma, but based on dental records, the remains were confirmed. It was Kay Josephine Medin, or at least most of her, because her skull was missing. Until then, no one had linked the box to Kay, but now, they had 2 pieces of the same puzzle, the skull in the mail, and the body in the woods. The body was found in an area so remote, so forgotten, that without the anonymous letter and map, it may never have been discovered. And here's the twist. That map, that letter, still, to this day, no one knows who sent it. Not a single fingerprint, no DNA on the envelope, no clues about where it was mailed from. Someone out there knew exactly where Kay's remains were dumped and had chosen to tell, but not to be found. This wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was a message, a signature, a shadow. Whoever had killed Kay had waited, then carefully, quietly mailed a piece of her to authorities, like some grotesque calling card. But why? Why return the remains? Why draw a map? Why now? This was no accident, no lost hiker, or unfortunate misstep. Kay Medin had been murdered, and someone had been watching, waiting, and maybe even taunting the investigators who failed to find her. The death certificate was issued. Kay's family mourned quietly, but something about it never sat right with locals or with Trinity County investigators. The lack of evidence, the cruelty, the deliberate nature of it all. Even in death, Kay's story didn't feel finished. And it wasn't, because 6 years later, in a place even more chilling than the last, her skull would return to the surface. February 16, 1993. A cold wind howled across the rugged cliffs of Trinidad Head, a coastal town in Humboldt County, California. The sea was restless that day, high tide churning against jagged rocks, waves carving the shoreline like knives. It was one of those days where everything felt heavy, ominous, as if the ocean itself was trying to give something back. And it did. That afternoon, a local beachcomber walking near the waterline stumbled upon something unnatural. Lying half buried in the wet sand, as if the tide itself had gently pushed it ashore, was part of a human skull. No hair, no tissue, just pale bone, smoothed slightly by salt and time. The beachcomber froze, then ran. Within hours, deputies from the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office cordoned off the area. Forensics were called in, and questions flooded the air like fog off the water. Who did this belong to? How long had it been out there? And most disturbingly, was this related to the box they received 6 years earlier? At the time, there was no clear connection. Forensic analysis was limited in 1993. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. All they could determine was that the skull fragment belonged to a white adult woman, likely over 40 years old. No match to missing persons, no dental records available for comparison, so they did what they could. They logged it, they stored it, and they waited. Meanwhile, the mystery of Kay Josephine Medin had faded from the public eye. In Trinity County, her case was cold, not closed, but cold. The investigation had grown quiet. Her loved ones moved on the best they could. Some believed she had been a random victim. Others whispered that she was silenced for a reason, but no one expected her to speak again, especially not from the sea. Fast forward to 2024, over 30 years after Kay vanished, and more than 3 decades since her bones were found in the forest. That same skull fragment, long forgotten in a storage facility at the sheriff's office, was selected for a new round of testing through a revolutionary program. Forensic genetic genealogy. The technology, funded by a federal grant, was developed by Othram Inc., a company leading the charge in solving cold cases using degraded DNA. They could take minute traces of genetic material from even the most damaged bones and compare it against millions of public DNA profiles. The skull fragment was sent to Othram's lab in Texas, and months later, a name surfaced. Not from fingerprints, not from dental records, but from bloodlines. A direct match to Kay Josephine Medin's daughter. The skull found on Trinidad Beach, nearly 100 miles from where her body was originally discovered, had washed ashore 6 years after her murder. Same woman, same case, but now with new questions. How did her skull get so far from the original dump site? Had someone moved it? Was this a trophy taken, kept, then discarded? Or had nature, or something darker, carried her last remains away to sea? Detectives revisited the original crime scene near Ammon Ridge, comparing weather patterns, animal migration and logging routes. But nothing explained the distance. Not logically, not naturally. Only one conclusion made sense. Kay had been murdered, she had been dismembered. And someone, her killer, had likely scattered her remains intentionally, using the rugged wilderness and the Pacific tides to hide her forever. But even then, the ocean gave her back. The case was suddenly open again, only now it had a face, a timeline, a name confirmed by science, but there was still no suspect. And that meant the most disturbing part was still to come. Kay's killer may still be alive, still free, and still watching, because someone knew exactly where to dump her body. Someone knew how to evade justice for 38 years, and someone, out there, mailed her skull to the police, on purpose. You don't stumble across a dismembered woman's remains in the forest by accident, and you definitely don't mail her skull to the police with a map unless you're trying to send a message. But for 38 years, that message has remained untranslated, because no suspect has ever been identified in the murder of Kay Josephine Medin. Not one, not officially. Yet behind the quiet case files, the rumors have always swirled, theories that whisper through the Trinity Mountains like wind through the trees. Some are grounded in logic, others lean into the surreal. But one thing is consistent across every theory: whoever killed Kay knew her, and they knew the area well enough to bury her, where no one would ever find her, unless they were led there, and someone did lead them there. So now we ask the question, who would want Kay dead, and why would they wait 6 years to tell anyone where to find her? Let's begin with the obvious. Theory 1. The husband, Nicholas Medin, was the first and only person to report Kay missing. He was also the last person to see her alive, and when investigators searched the home, they found no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no robbery, no evidence of an outside perpetrator. A classic red flag in domestic homicide cases. But Nicholas passed multiple polygraph tests. He had an alibi for the days surrounding her disappearance. He was reportedly hundreds of miles away, at a business meeting in San Jose. No blood was found in the house. No neighbors reported hearing anything strange. And most importantly, there was no known history of domestic violence between the two. Still, police never ruled him out, and after Kay's remains were identified, he refused to speak to the media. Some call that grief, others call it guilt. But what really muddies the waters is the timeline. Nicholas didn't report Kay missing until 3 days after he returned. Why? He claimed he assumed she had gone to visit her mother again. But Kay's mother denied that she'd made any plans to come back. And Kay had never left home without telling someone, not once in her life. So the question lingers, was Nicholas trying to buy time? Theory 2. A local stalker. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Kay had reportedly confided in 2 co-workers about a man who had begun frequenting her school parking lot. He never approached her, never said anything threatening, but he watched, from his truck, day after day. She mentioned it to her principal once, casually, almost as a joke, but nothing official was reported. That same truck, an old red Ford pickup, was spotted by another teacher at a grocery store parking lot in Weaverville, sitting, waiting. The man was never identified, and here's the chilling part. A similar truck was spotted parked on a dirt logging road just miles from where Kay's body was eventually found. The same road, in fact drawn on the map sent in 1987. Coincidence? Maybe, but a disturbing one. The logging road was on private property, not somewhere a drifter would just wander. It was deep, concealed, and dangerously isolated, perfect for hiding a body, and even more perfect for someone who had hunted before. Theory 3. Ritualistic or message killing. This one leans into the eerie. The fact that her skull was separated from her body. The fact that it was mailed to the police station with a cryptic map 6 years later, not immediately, not after the crime. Years later. This wasn't just disposal, this was a deliberate act. Was it guilt? A killer with remorse who wanted her found? Or was it control? Someone who wanted to decide when the body was discovered, and how? Criminal profilers have long speculated that mailing remains is often about power, not about justice, not about redemption. It's about saying I'm still here, and I decide the narrative. Which means the killer may have been watching the investigation the whole time, reading the headlines, waiting for the case to go cold, so he could stir it back to life. Theory 4. The random predator who wasn't random at all. Trinity County in the 1980s was a haven for isolated drifters, survivalists, and off-grid loners. The kind of place people went when they didn't want to be found. In fact, between 1984 and 1989, there were 7 unsolved disappearances of women in Northern California counties bordering Trinity. Most were assumed to be isolated events. Some were later linked to known killers, but a few, like Kay, stood alone. There's one cold theory, still passed around by retired investigators, that Kay's killer was a repeat offender, someone who had done it before and after, and mailing the skull might have been a signature, his way of saying, I'm done with this one. Here's your closure, like discarding a finished trophy. But whatever theory you believe, one thing remains true. Someone went through extraordinary effort to hide her. They knew the terrain. They knew how to avoid detection, and they waited years before giving the police just enough to find her, but not find them. In the world of true crime, time is the enemy of evidence. Blood fades, memories warp, witnesses disappear, or forget, or stay silent. And in the case of Kay Josephine Medin, 38 years passed between the day she vanished and the day her story was finally confirmed. But confirmation is not closure, and identification is not justice. When Kay's skull fragment was finally matched to her identity in 2024, thanks to cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy, Trinity County reopened the case file, quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't announced on the news. There were no press conferences, no updates from the sheriff's department. Only one line quietly added to the official records. Remains confirmed as Kay Medin. Homicide suspected. Investigation ongoing. Still, after nearly 4 decades, and still, no suspect named. But now they had something they didn't have before. Genetic connections. The DNA used to match Kay didn't just confirm her identity, it connected her to a broader genealogical map, a family tree, with thousands of distant cousins, third-degree relatives, and surnames that could be mapped across the country. And buried in that data was the possibility of finding her killer's DNA, if only they could connect the dots. Because the skull fragment wasn't clean, it carried trace biological residue, too degraded in 1993 to read. But now there was a chance. Enter Ulthram Labs, a private forensic powerhouse, responsible for solving hundreds of cold cases thought unsolvable, using scraps of degraded material and sheer computing power. The skull was shipped again, this time not just to identify Kay, but to identify who might have touched her remains. The process was grueling. Months of analysis, genome building, cross-matching profiles through GDED match and family tree DNA, and one profile kept appearing in proximity. A man, now in his late 70s, still living in Northern California, a name that had been on no suspect list, a man with no known connection to Kay, no criminal record, no history of violence, but with ancestral links strong enough to suggest he was either the killer or the killer's blood, a nephew, a brother, a son. Authorities haven't said, but internally the Trinity County Sheriff's Office has launched what they call an ancestral circle investigation, a slow, methodical approach to reverse building the killer's family tree, until one branch points directly to the person who mailed that skull and killed Kay. But while technology inches forward, time pulls everything else backward. Kay's husband, Nicholas, died in 2018. Her mother in 2009. Her children remain silent. choosing not to speak publicly since the case reopened. And that silence, it lingers, like fog on the ridges where Kay was buried. It raises questions. Did they know something? Did Kay confide in them about threats, a stalker, a suspicion, or are they, like everyone else, just holding on to grief that never got a name? And then there's this final haunting question. Why was her skull returned? Not dumped, not buried, but deliberately mailed to the very people trying to solve the case. Why draw a map? Why give up a body and not a name? Some believe it was guilt, that the killer, older now, felt the weight of their crime and wanted Kay to be found before they died. Others think it was taunting, a cold, calculated move meant to reignite fear and show who was still in control. But the most disturbing theory, that the skull wasn't returned by the killer, but by an accomplice, someone who knew, someone who had always known, and who, like a ghost, waited until the world had forgotten, just enough to bring Kay's voice back from the silence. Kay Josephine Medin was not just a school teacher, not just a missing person. She was a woman who vanished without reason. She was a mother, a wife, a daughter, buried in the shadows of the forest and then unearthed by the tide. And her story is not over, because somewhere, perhaps still living in those same wooded hills, or looking out from some isolated coastal town, is the person who took her life. Someone who kept her secrets, someone who mailed a skull, someone who might be watching this story right now. If this story gripped you, disturbed you, and reminded you that some killers never leave the shadows, do not let Kay's story be forgotten again. Like this video if you believe Kay deserves justice. Share her story. Someone out there might know something. Subscribe for more unsolved cases, shocking reunions, and true stories that must be heard. Because we don't just tell stories here, we make sure they're never buried again.